It is January 1, 1963. The civil rights movement is accelerating. Vietnam is a word Americans are beginning to hear more often. And John Kennedy, entering the third year of his presidency, is about to face the hardest months of his administration. A woman is going to publish a book that millions of women have been waiting for without knowing it. A group of monks in South Vietnam are going to march through the streets of Saigon in silence. And one photograph is going to change what America thinks it is doing there. And on August 28th, 250,000 people are going to stand on the National Mall and listen to a man set aside his prepared remarks and speak from somewhere deeper. And then November will arrive. And after November, nothing will be the same. And some of the questions that begin in November will never be answered. These are the 10 moments that defined 1963. Some of them you remember. Some of them you only thought you did. Let's begin. Number 10. The Feminine Mystique, Betty Friedan. In February 1963, a book called The Feminine Mystique was published by W. Norton. Its author was Betty Friedan, a journalist and mother of 3 who had spent 5 years researching a question she first encountered in a survey of her Smith College classmates 15 years after graduation. The question was simple. Are you happy? The answers were not. Friedan called it the problem that has no name, the pervasive, unspoken dissatisfaction of educated American women who had been told that marriage, children, and a well-kept house were the complete fulfillment of female existence. Women who felt that dissatisfaction, she argued, had been taught to believe that the feeling itself was the problem, that they were neurotic, ungrateful, incomplete. The book told them otherwise. The Feminine Mystique sold 1 million copies in its first year, 3 million in its first 3 years. Letters poured into Friedan's publisher from women across the country who wrote that the book had described something they had felt for years and had never seen written down. The book did not create the women's movement, but it created the language the movement needed, and it put that language into the hands of millions of women who had not yet found each other. The problem that had no name finally had one. How many things that shaped your life began with someone finding the words for something that had always been felt but never said? But what happened next would overshadow even this. Number 9. The Great Train Robbery. At approximately 3 in the morning on August 8, 1963, a Royal Mail train traveling from Glasgow to London was stopped at a tampered signal on a remote stretch of track in Buckinghamshire, England. 15 men were waiting. They overpowered the train crew, formed a human chain down the embankment, and in the space of 20 minutes transferred 120 mail sacks containing £2.5 million in used banknotes to waiting vehicles below. The entire operation was over before any alarm was raised. The robbery had been planned for months. The gang included career criminals, a corrupt postal worker who provided the intelligence, and a retired train driver brought in to move the locomotive. The retired driver, at the critical moment, found he could not operate the newer model and had to be replaced at the last minute by a gang member with limited experience. Police investigation began within hours. Most of the gang had retreated to a farmhouse called Leatherslade, which they had failed to adequately clean before abandoning. Fingerprints were found. Arrests followed within weeks. Sentences of up to 30 years were handed down, widely considered disproportionate, even by the standards of the time. One gang member, Ronnie Biggs, escaped from prison in 1965 and spent the next 36 years as a fugitive, living in Australia, then Brazil, becoming a peculiar kind of celebrity exile, giving interviews, releasing a record with the Sex Pistols. He returned voluntarily to England in 2001, and was immediately arrested. He died in 2013. What does it mean when the person who commits the crime becomes more famous than the crime itself, and the story of the escape outlasts the story of the robbery? Number 8. Alcatraz Closes. On March 21, 1963, the last 27 prisoners held at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary were transferred to other facilities. The island fell silent for the first time in nearly 30 years. Alcatraz had opened as a federal prison in 1934 on a rocky island in San Francisco Bay that had previously been a military fortress. The Bureau of Prisons intended it as the end of the line, a maximum security facility for the most dangerous and disruptive prisoners in the federal system, men who had proven unmanageable everywhere else. Over its 29 years of operation, it held some of the most notorious criminals in American history: Al Capone, George Machine Gun Kelly, Robert Stroud, the Birdman of Alcatraz. The reason it closed was not security failure. It was economics. Alcatraz cost nearly 3 times as much per prisoner per day to operate as any comparable mainland facility, because everything, including fresh water, had to be brought to the island by boat. The buildings were deteriorating. The salt air was winning. In the year it closed, a breakout had recently been attempted. 3 men had tunneled out of their cells, built makeshift rafts, and entered the bay. Their bodies were never found. Whether they drowned or escaped has never been definitively established. The island is a national park today. 2 million people visit it every year. They walk through the cell block, stand in the cells, look out through the bars at the bay. The mythology of the place has entirely outlasted its function, which is, perhaps, the most American thing about it. What does it mean when a prison becomes a tourist destination, and the story we tell about it is a story about freedom? And yet, the real weight of 1963 was still ahead. Number 7. The March on Washington. On August 28, 1963, 250,000 people gathered on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. They had come from every state in the country, by bus, by train, by car, on foot. They were black and white. They were there to march for jobs and freedom, to demand that Congress pass the Civil Rights Act that Kennedy had introduced in June and that was stalled in committee. The morning began with music and speeches. The crowd was enormous and the heat was punishing. John Lewis, 23 years old, chairman of SNCC, gave a speech that had been partially censored by march organizers. They had asked him to remove language they considered too confrontational. He removed it. He gave the speech anyway, and it was the most direct address of the day. And then, near the end of the program, Martin Luther King Jr. stepped to the microphone. He had prepared a formal speech. He delivered most of it. And then, partway through, the gospel singer Mahalia Jackson called out from behind him, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." He set his notes aside. What came next was not in the prepared text. "I have a dream," he said, "that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed." The words were not new. King had used versions of the dream language in earlier speeches. But on that afternoon, on those steps, before that crowd, they became something they had not been before. They became the sentence that would define the movement and the man for the rest of history. How many of the words we consider timeless were, in the moment they were spoken, improvised? Number 6. Alabama. Bull Connor and the Fire Hoses. In the spring of 1963, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference launched a campaign to desegregate downtown Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham was, by most measures, the most segregated city in the United States. It had been the site of more unsolved bombings of black homes and churches than any other American city. So many that it had been given the nickname Dynamite Hill. Its commissioner of public safety was a man named Theophilus Eugene Connor, known universally as Bull Connor, who had built his career on the violent suppression of civil rights activity. The campaign's strategy was deliberate. Organizers filled the jails with protesters, and when the adult volunteers ran low, they called on the students. On May 2nd, more than 1,000 black schoolchildren, some as young as 6, marched out of 16th Street Baptist Church and into the streets. Bull Connor's response was to order fire hoses and police dogs turned on the marchers. The photographs went around the world. Images of high-pressure water knocking children off their feet, of police dogs lunging at teenagers in church clothes, were published on front pages across the United States and in newspapers in London, Paris, Tokyo, and Moscow. The Soviets used them in propaganda broadcasts. American ambassadors abroad reported that the photographs had caused serious damage to the country's international standing. Kennedy was moved, politically, and by most accounts, personally. He accelerated his push for civil rights legislation. The Civil Rights Act that became law in 1964 was born, in significant part, in the streets of Birmingham in May 1963. When does a photograph stop being a document and become the thing that changes what the document describes? We're only halfway through 1963. What's coming will surprise you. Number 5. Medgar Evers' assassination. Shortly after midnight, on June 12, 1963, Medgar Evers pulled into the driveway of his home in Jackson, Mississippi. He had just returned from a meeting. He was 37 years old, a World War II veteran, the NAACP's field director for Mississippi, and one of the most effective civil rights organizers in the Deep South. He had received death threats regularly for years. He wore a bulletproof vest on some days. He was not wearing one that night. As he stepped out of his car, he was shot in the back by a high-powered rifle. His wife and children, watching television inside the house, heard the shot. He died at a Jackson hospital less than an hour later, after initially being refused treatment because of his race, until the staff realized who he was. A suspect was identified almost immediately: Byron de la Beckwith, a white supremacist and Citizens Council member. He was tried twice in 1964. Both juries, all white, deadlocked. He walked free. He remained free for 30 years. In 1994, 31 years after the murder, Myrlie Evers, Medgar's widow, persuaded the state of Mississippi to retry her husband's killer. This time, the jury convicted. Byron de la Beckwith was sentenced to life in prison. He died there in 2001. Medgar Evers had been dead for 38 years when justice finally arrived. His widow had spent those 38 years making sure it did. What does it cost, in years, in effort, in the weight of carrying it, to refuse to let a thing be forgotten? Number 4. The Profumo Affair. In March 1963, John Profumo, the British Secretary of State for War, a married man, a decorated war veteran, a pillar of the conservative establishment, stood up in the House of Commons and denied having had an improper relationship with a young woman named Christine Keeler. He was lying. Keeler was a 19-year-old model and showgirl who had been introduced to Profumo at a party at Cliveden, the country estate of Viscount Astor, in the summer of 1961. She was, at the same time, involved with Yevgeny Ivanov, a Soviet naval attaché, widely understood to be an intelligence officer. A British cabinet minister and a Soviet spy were sharing the same woman. At the height of the Cold War, the cover-up unraveled slowly, then all at once. In June 1963, Profumo admitted to the House of Commons that he had lied. He resigned the same day. He never returned to public life, spending the next 40 years doing volunteer charity work in the East End of London, a form of penance he maintained until his death in 2006. The scandal brought down not just Profumo, but Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, who resigned citing ill health, but whose government had been fatally weakened by the affair. It became a symbol, in Britain and beyond, of the gap between the public virtue of the establishment and the private conduct of the men within it. Christine Keeler was prosecuted for perjury in an unrelated case and served time in prison. The men whose careers depended on her silence faced no criminal consequences. Scandals reveal what institutions actually protect, not the public, not the truth, but themselves. When did that surprise anyone? The top 3 events of 1963 are ones you think you know. You don't. Number 3. The Buddhist crisis. Vietnam. In May 1963, the government of South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem banned the display of Buddhist flags during a religious celebration. South Vietnam was a country in which the majority of the population was Buddhist, governed by a Catholic family dynasty that had been installed and sustained by American support. When Buddhist protesters defied the flag ban, government forces fired into the crowd, killing 9 people. The protests spread. On June 11, 1963, an elderly Buddhist monk named Thich Quang Duc sat down at a busy Saigon intersection. Fellow monks poured petrol over him. He lit a match. An American journalist, David Halberstam, was present. A photographer, Malcolm Brown, had been tipped off by the monks and was waiting. The photograph Brown took was published on front pages around the world the following day. Kennedy, shown the photograph, reportedly said, "Jesus Christ." Madame Nhu, the sister-in-law of Diem, who served as the regime's public face, called the self-immolation a barbecue. The comment was broadcast internationally. In November 1963, with American knowledge and tacit approval, South Vietnamese military officers staged a coup against Diem. He was captured and assassinated. Kennedy was reportedly shocked by the killing, having expected Diem to be exiled rather than murdered. 3 weeks later, Kennedy himself was dead. The war he had escalated, and whose direction he had privately questioned in his final months, would be inherited by a new president with different instincts about what the United States was doing in Southeast Asia. When a government funds a war it cannot fully see, who is responsible for what happens in the rooms it is not watching? Number 2. JFK Assassination. Dallas. At 12:30 in the afternoon on November 22, 1963, President Kennedy's motorcade turned into Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas. It was a bright autumn Friday. The crowds along the route had been warm and large. Kennedy was in an open-topped limousine, waving to the crowd. His wife, Jacqueline, sat beside him in a pink Chanel suit. 3 shots were fired. Kennedy was struck twice. He was pronounced dead at Parkland Memorial Hospital at 1 p.m. Within the hour, Lee Harvey Oswald, a 24-year-old former Marine who had defected to the Soviet Union and returned, was arrested at a movie theater in the Oak Cliff neighborhood of Dallas, initially for the murder of a police officer shot shortly after the assassination. He was charged with Kennedy's murder that evening. He denied everything. "I'm a patsy," he told reporters in the police station corridor. Just a patsy. Lyndon Baines Johnson was sworn in as president aboard Air Force One at 2:38 p.m., with Jacqueline Kennedy standing beside him, still in the pink suit. The photograph taken at that moment, her expression, the tight space of the plane's cabin, the brevity of the ceremony, is one of the most studied images in American history. The nation went into shock. Television networks broadcast continuously for 4 days. Schools closed. Markets closed. People who were alive that day have never forgotten where they were when they heard. What does it do to a country to lose in a single afternoon the person who represented what it believed itself to be becoming? Number 1. Oswald, Jack Ruby, and the questions that never ended. And at number 1, the moment that defined everything else. 2 days after the assassination, on the morning of November 24, 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald was being transferred from Dallas Police Headquarters to the county jail. The transfer was being conducted in public. The Dallas police had invited press and television cameras into the basement to observe. Millions of Americans were watching live on television. At 11:21 a.m., as Oswald was walked through the basement corridor, a man stepped out of the crowd, placed a revolver against Oswald's abdomen, and fired. The whole world watched it happen. In real time. On live television. In a police station. The man with the gun was Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner with documented connections to local law enforcement and, according to later investigations, to figures in organized crime. He told police he had acted out of grief for the president and a desire to spare Jacqueline Kennedy the ordeal of a trial. Whether that was the full truth has never been established. The Warren Commission, established by President Johnson and chaired by Chief Justice Earl Warren, concluded in 1964 that Oswald had acted alone and that Ruby had acted alone. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, investigating in 1979, concluded that Kennedy was probably killed as the result of a conspiracy, but could not identify the conspirators. The files, the witnesses, the timing, the connections. 60 years of investigation, declassification, and analysis have produced not a settled answer, but a more detailed map of how much remains unsettled. Oswald never stood trial. He never gave a full account. He was the only man ever charged with Kennedy's murder, and he was killed before he could speak. What remains is what has always remained. The question. Asked by everyone. Answered by no one. When the man accused of the crime of the century is killed before he can speak, what do we call the silence that follows? 1963 ended in a country that did not fully recognize itself. A woman had published a book that named something millions had felt, but never said. 250,000 people had stood on the mall and heard a man speak about a dream. A civil rights organizer had been shot in his own driveway and waited 31 years for justice. 250,000 marchers had filled Washington, and then November had come. The questions that began on November 22nd have never fully closed. The Warren Commission tried. Later investigations tried. The files are still being released, decades later, a few pages at a time. What 1963 left behind was not just grief, it was uncertainty. The feeling that something had happened that the country did not fully understand, and might never fully understand. That the official story and the full story were not quite the same thing. If you found this video worth your time, subscribe to Reminder Machinery. Every week, we return to a year that shaped the country you're living in, and we tell you the full story. The next year is waiting. Let's go.